Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. We're going to be talking about trig derivatives and trig reciprocals. Before we get into this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. So we're going to be talking about these different derivatives. So tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant all require quotient rule. And the reason why they require quotient rule is in order to find their derivative, we have to remind ourselves that tangent is the same thing as saying sine divided by cosine. So we are going to use quotient rule to go ahead and help us out. So things that we want to remember when we do quotient rule: the top is always u, the bottom is always v, and the derivative is u prime times v minus v prime times u, all divided by v squared. So in this case, my top function u is sine, my bottom function v is cosine. So the derivative of sine is cosine times the bottom function cosine minus the derivative of cosine, which is negative sine, times sine, all divided by the denominator cosine squared. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and clean this up just a little bit. So cosine times cosine is cosine squared. Minus a negative is plus. Sine times sine is sine squared, and I can rewrite cosine squared as cosine squared. So one of the things that we learn in pre-calc is things to do with trig. And one of those things happens to be a Pythagorean identity. So one of the Pythagorean identities that we learn is that cosine squared plus sine squared always equals something very specific. And it always equals this thing 1. So we are going to be using sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And we are going to replace everything in the numerator of our fraction with 1. So we have 1 over cosine squared. Well, 1 over cosine is the same thing as secant. So if I have 1 over cosine and another 1 over cosine, that is just secant squared. So 1 over cosine squared is the same thing as secant squared. So this is our derivative. So anytime we see the derivative of tangent, we can now know that it's secant squared. It would be easier to do that than having to remember all of this, but this is why it is what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and write secant squared over here. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at cotangent. So we're going to do the same thing. The cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, so cotangent is cosine over sine. So we're going to do the same thing again. This time cosine is u and sine is v. So f prime of x equals the derivative of cosine is negative sine times the bottom sine minus the derivative of sine, which is cosine, times the top cosine, all divided by sine squared. Okay, so we have negative sine squared. We have a minus cosine squared, and dividing it by sine squared. So we don't quite have sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, but that's the only one that we can use. So we have to have it say sine squared plus cosine squared. So in order to kind of get around this, what we're going to do is factor out what they have in common. So they have a factor of negative 1 in front. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative 1 from both things. So we have sine squared plus cosine squared now. And we are still dividing by sine squared. Now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and switch it out. So I have negative 1 times positive 1. Negative 1 times positive 1 is just negative 1. And 1 over sine is the same thing as cosecant. So this would be negative cosecant squared x. So just like tangent, this is how we would find it, but once we know the derivative, we don't need to go through this process a bunch of times. So derivative of cosine negative cosecant squared x. You're going to notice that tangent and cotangent are very similar, just like sine and cosine are very similar. Okay, secant. Secant is the same thing as saying 1 over cosine. Even though it feels like we should just be able to do this one really easily, we still have to use quotient rule. So this time our top function is 1 and our bottom function is cosine. So f prime of x equals the derivative of 1 is 0 times cosine of x minus the derivative of cosine is negative sine times 1, all divided by cosine of x squared. So this is one where it kind of simplifies out really nicely, but also not nicely at the same time. So 0 times cosine makes it all go away. We have a negative times a negative, which is a positive, or we have minus a negative, which is a positive, and sine of x times 1. So we have sine of x divided by cosine squared of x. So here is where, like, when we look at this, it doesn't really make sense on how we get it, but the next thing that we are going to be doing is very specifically so that way we can get the answer that we want. So what I'm going to be doing is I am going to split up sine into 1 times sine of x, and I'm going to go ahead and split the denominator up to cosine of x times cosine of x. Ugh. Well, all I'm doing is multiplying two things together on top and bottom, so I can go ahead and split those two things up into two separate fractions. So I can split up 1 in sine, and I can split up my two cosines into separate fractions. I know I can do this because if I were to multiply these back together, we multiply fractions, numerators together, denominators together, we get the same thing. 1 over cosine is the same thing as what we started with. It's secant. And sine over cosine is tangent. So we get secant x times tangent x, or tangent x times secant x, depending on how you split it up. So the derivative of secant x times tangent x. Okay, knowing that there's going to be a pattern, take a second, think about what you would decide that cosecant might be based off of how secant is and how our pattern has happened with our other derivatives for trig. Okay, we have cosecant. Cosecant is the same thing as 1 over sine of x. U is 1, V is sine. So f prime of x equals the derivative of 1 is 0 times sine of x minus the derivative of sine, which is cosine, times 1 divided by sine squared of x. 0 times sine goes away. 1 times cosine is cosine, so we have minus cosine of x, or negative cosine, divided by sine squared. So just like before, we're going to split this up. So I have negative 1 times cosine of x divided by sine of x times another sine of x. I'm going to split this up into two fractions. So I have negative 1 over sine of x times cosine x over sine of x. So negative 1 over sine is the same thing as negative cosecant x times cosine over sine, which is cotangent x. So our last one, negative cosecant x cotangent x. So one of the things that's really nice about our trig derivatives is all of our derivatives that start with the letter C, so cosine, cotangent, cosecant, all have a negative in their derivative versus sine, secant, and tangent, which are positive. So that's just kind of helpful when we have to know which one's negative and which one's not. So we are going to be kind of practicing all of the skills that we've learned from this unit because this is the end of Unit 2 for AP. So we're just going to be practicing what we got. So the biggest thing that you guys need to be able to do is know these derivative rules because they can kind of show up whenever. So knowing them is the big key here.